My wife wanted half of everything I owned after sleeping with her ex. So I vanished and rebuilt my life in secret, only to find true love. I never thought the sound of a familiar voice could feel like a knife being driven through my heart. That evening, the voice was my wife's, and the words she spoke changed everything. In that brief, agonizing moment, I realized that the life I thought I knew was nothing but an illusion. I learned not only that I had been betrayed, but that my trust had been shattered beyond repair. Yet, that day, which began with the ultimate betrayal, would eventually become the starting point of a journey towards an unexpected renewal of life. I remember it vividly, a Thursday evening after a long, brutal day at work. It seemed like every possible thing that could go wrong at the office had. And to make matters worse, my boss blamed me for an error I didn't even make. As I pulled up to my house, already weary from the weight of a miserable week, I noticed my sister-in-law's car blocking my driveway. There was no reason for her to be there. I had to park a few houses away, dodging the cars of our neighbors' teenagers that lined the street. My life had, until this point, been predictable, even if it wasn't fulfilling. My wife, Janice, and I had been married for 10 years, and though we had our rough patches, I never imagined what awaited me beyond that front door. Inside, I found Janice and her sister, Susan, sitting in the living room, music playing softly, laughter in the air. I decided to grab a beer before joining them. Maybe this would be the beginning of a better evening, I thought. But then, as I opened the refrigerator, I heard the words that would change my life. He ****ed me 3 times today, Janice said, her voice filled with an unfamiliar excitement. She wasn't talking to Susan. She was talking about her ex, someone she had promised me was long in her past. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. My chest tightened, and for a moment, the world around me blurred. The days that followed felt like a haze. I was a ghost drifting through my own life, someone whose reality had been stolen. I tried talking to Janice, hoping for an explanation that could undo the damage. But what I got instead was denial, anger, and blame. She even tried making it my fault, accusing me of neglecting her needs or being distant. My efforts at reconciliation were useless. And with every word, the gap between us widened until it felt impossible to bridge. There was no escaping the truth. The woman I had once called my partner had betrayed me. And there was no going back. I decided to leave. There was no time for half measures. I needed to vanish, to start over and leave behind everything that once defined me. I had friends willing to help, friends like Jake, who offered me a car and told me that he would keep my old one under wraps. Disappear, Carson, just do it, he told me, and with that, I began the journey to a new life. I traded my comfortable but confining home for the wide open skies and endless fields of the western countryside. I found myself on a remote ranch, working as a farmhand in a place that seemed a world away from the urban life I had once led. My days were filled with long, hard labor, replacing fences, feeding livestock, and learning the lay of the land. The work left me physically exhausted, but it was also freeing. Here, I was just Carson. I had no past, no expectations to meet, and no lies to uphold. I was given a small cabin to stay in, with little more than a bed, a stove, and a window that faced the mountains. But it was enough. The simplicity was healing. Day by day, I felt myself shedding the weight of my former life. And though I was alone, I no longer felt lonely. But Caitlin, she was different. Caitlin was the ranch owner's daughter. And she was nothing like Janice. Where Janice had always seemed to demand attention, Caitlin was independent and strong, accustomed to the harsh realities of ranch life. Our first encounters were rough. She eyed me suspiciously, and I could sense that she wasn't exactly thrilled with my sudden presence on her family's land. But over time, something changed. Maybe it was the way I refused to give up, even when I had blisters on my hands from the work. Or maybe it was how I laughed, even when things went wrong. Slowly, Caitlin started to warm up to me, and we began to share small moments, a meal at the ranch, a conversation while tending to the horses, or a shared glance that lingered longer than it should. It was on a day like any other, when we were fixing a section of the fence on the far edge of the property. That something shifted. We had been working for hours, and as the sun began to set, Caitlin looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, soft, almost vulnerable. She told me that she admired how I never seemed to give up, even when things got tough. I wanted to tell her everything, about why I was really there, about the pain I had left behind, but instead, I just smiled. For the first time since leaving Janice, I felt something stir inside me. I felt hope. Our relationship grew slowly, but surely. We were cautious, both of us carrying wounds from our pasts that still stung. Caitlin had lost her mother years ago, and the ranch was her way of holding onto the memories of her family. She was fiercely protective of her father and the land, and I admired that about her. She saw strength in me, and I saw resilience in her. Together, we began to build something real, something that wasn't tainted by lies or betrayal. We spent our days working side by side, and our nights talking under the stars. It wasn't long before I realized that I was falling for her. But falling for Caitlin was different. It wasn't like the reckless love I had once felt for Janice. It was steady, secure, and true. One evening, after a particularly long day, Caitlin and I sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange. She turned to me and asked, "Why are you here, Carson? Why did you come to this place?" I hesitated, but then I told her the truth. I told her about Janice, about the betrayal, and about how I had left everything behind to start over. She listened quietly, her eyes never leaving mine. And when I finished, she placed her hand on mine. "You're here because you deserve a new beginning," she said softly, and that was all I needed to hear. The months that followed were some of the best of my life. Caitlin and I became inseparable, and we worked together to make the ranch even better. She was in the process of getting her veterinarian license, and I helped her set up a small clinic on the property. We cared for the animals together, and soon, it felt like we were caring for each other as well. The ranch became our sanctuary, a place where we could both heal from the past and look forward to the future. In time, we married. It was a small, simple ceremony, held in the pasture under a clear blue sky. Only a handful of friends and family attended, but it was perfect. I remember looking at Caitlin, her eyes filled with love and determination, and feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. This was my second chance, a chance I never thought I would get. We spent our honeymoon in Fiji, a place Caitlin had always dreamed of visiting, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. Life wasn't always easy after that. There were challenges, the ranch demanded constant work, and Caitlin's veterinary practice kept her busy. But every struggle was worth it, because we faced them together. And that was the difference. With Janice, I had always felt like I was walking alone, even when we were side by side. With Caitlin, I knew that no matter what happened, we would face it together. She made me feel whole again, and I knew that I had finally found my place in the world. As the years passed, we continued to build our life together. We expanded the ranch, took in more animals, and even started a family. Caitlin gave birth to our daughter, and the first time I held her in my arms, I knew that every pain, every heartbreak, and every moment of despair had led me to this. It had led me to Caitlin, to our daughter, and to a life that was more beautiful than anything I could have imagined. Reflecting on my journey, I realized that the betrayal I experienced wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. Sometimes, life forces us to let go of the things we think we need, so we can find the things we truly deserve. My relationship with Janice taught me about pain, but my relationship with Caitlin taught me about love, trust, and resilience. It taught me that even when life falls apart, there is always a way to rebuild, to find something even better. To those who have faced betrayal, heartbreak, or loss, know that it isn't the end. It might feel like your world is falling apart, but sometimes, the pieces fall so that they can be rebuilt in a way that is more beautiful and meaningful. My journey from betrayal to renewal wasn't easy, but it was worth every struggle, every tear, and every sacrifice. I found my way back to love, and I found a partner who would stand by me through anything. And that, to me, was worth everything. Sometimes, when the night is quiet, and the world around me is still, I find myself thinking about Janice. I wonder if she found happiness, if she ever regretted what she did. But then I look at Caitlin, at our daughter, and at the life we've built together, and I know that none of that matters. What matters is that I took the leap. I trusted myself enough to walk away, and I found my way to something better. Betrayal might have broken me, but it also led me to a life that was full of love, laughter, and hope, and for that, I will always be grateful. Wife set me up with her friend's hot sister to test my loyalty on a work trip. When I found out, I was incensed. And now she wants to fix things. The human heart can be a fragile thing. And the game of trust is one that needs care, honesty, and understanding. However, not all people play by the rules. And sometimes we all need a harsh lesson in what can happen when we test the limits of love. Let me take you on a journey of how one relationship was tested to its breaking point, and what the aftermath looked like. This is the story of how a marriage, only 3 months old, was thrown into turmoil by an unexpected and unimaginable test. I met Amy when we were both quite young. I was 23 and she was 22 when we decided to get married. And we thought we had it all figured out. In our minds, marriage was supposed to be the logical next step for two people who were deeply in love. It was like we were swimming in bliss, blind to the depths of the challenges that lay ahead. In many ways, we were still kids, eager to live our lives in unison, without truly knowing the intricacies and complexities of being someone else's partner for life. Amy, my wife, had just started college at 20, a little later than most of her peers. It didn't bother me at all, if anything. I admired her tenacity and willingness to chase her dreams, while she was attending college and working a part-time job at a coffee shop. I took on the role of the sole provider for our household. I hadn't gone to college, but I had managed to carve out a decent life for myself in the workforce. I worked my way up the ladder, and things were looking promising. In fact, I had just been promoted from a union job to management, which meant a significant pay raise and a lot of new opportunities. Everything seemed to be falling into place, or so I thought. My promotion came with the requirement of attending a week-long training course at my company's headquarters, which was located about 1.200 miles away. I remember sitting down with Amy and explaining the trip to her, believing that she would be understanding of the fact that it was an important opportunity for me. Instead, she looked at me, her eyes widening slightly, and asked if she could come along. It was a request that, on the surface, seemed innocent and sweet. I mean, who wouldn't want to spend more time with their spouse? Especially when the honeymoon phase was still in full swing. But as much as I loved the idea of having Amy with me, the financial reality hit me like a cold splash of water. The cost of her flight, her meals, and adding her to the hotel room would significantly strain our budget, a budget that we'd been sticking to strictly, as we were both very conscious of saving up for a down payment on a house and managing our expenses carefully. When I broke the news to her, Amy's reaction took me by surprise. She looked upset, her expression a mix of frustration and disappointment. She argued that we could put the expenses on my credit card. But I didn't want to take on more debt, especially if we couldn't pay it off immediately. She even suggested using our emergency fund. But to me, this didn't count as an emergency. It was a luxury we simply couldn't afford. And I thought she'd understand that. I thought wrong. Amy eventually relented, but the disappointment lingered in her eyes. She couldn't come with me. And although I assured her that we'd only be apart for a few days, something shifted between us that day. I thought that was the end of it, that Amy had accepted my reasoning and moved on. Little did I know, she was already planning a way to test my loyalty during my time away. When the day of my departure arrived, Amy hugged and kissed me, making me promise to call her often. I could see the sadness in her eyes, and I promised her that we'd be okay. After all, it was just a week. I'd be back before she knew it. The first few days went by smoothly. I attended my training classes, made some new connections, and felt a sense of pride in my accomplishments. I called Amy every night before going to bed, telling her about my day and listening to her stories about school and work. It all felt normal, until Wednesday morning. That morning, I was having breakfast at the hotel when a woman approached my table and asked if she could sit down. She was blonde, attractive, and seemed friendly enough. I figured she was just another guest who needed a place to sit since the restaurant was quite crowded. I didn't think much of it at the time. I finished my breakfast, exchanged a few polite words with her, and then went about my day. The next morning, I was back at the hotel restaurant when, once again, the same woman approached me. This time, there were empty tables, and yet she asked to join me again. I felt a bit uneasy, but I didn't want to be rude, so I let her sit down. She asked for my name, and I told her I had to leave, excusing myself from the conversation. Something felt off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I decided not to tell Amy about these encounters. I didn't want to worry her over something that seemed so trivial. By the time Friday rolled around, I was looking forward to heading back home. I had planned to treat myself to a nice steak dinner at a nearby sports bar before my flight the next morning. I was sitting at the bar, enjoying my meal, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. It was her again, the blonde woman. She was dressed up, her makeup perfectly applied, her smile bright and confident. She sat down next to me without asking, her eyes locking onto mine as she casually asked how my day had been. I was tired of her persistence, tired of the uncomfortable feeling that had been gnawing at me since our first encounter. I told her, in no uncertain terms, that I wasn't interested. I was married, and I had no desire to spend time with another woman. She seemed to find my resistance amusing, as if it were a challenge she was determined to overcome. When she went to the restroom, I took the opportunity to leave, abandoning my half-eaten steak and paying my bill in cash so I wouldn't have to wait for the receipt. That night, I called Amy and told her about the woman. I was frustrated and annoyed, and I needed to vent. I expected her to be upset on my behalf, to share in my frustration. Instead, her response left me speechless. "I'm proud of you," she said, her voice filled with an odd sense of satisfaction. "You passed the test." "What test?" I asked, confused. "The woman," Amy continued. "I asked her to be there. I wanted to see if you'd stay loyal to me." For a moment, I couldn't process what she was saying. It felt like the ground had shifted beneath my feet, and I was struggling to find my balance. Amy had set me up. She had orchestrated the entire thing, sending this woman, whose name, I learned, was Susan, to test my loyalty. The more Amy explained, the angrier I became. Susan was the older sister of one of Amy's friends, Jessica. Together, they had concocted this plan, believing it was a harmless way to ease Amy's insecurities. But it wasn't harmless. It was deceitful, manipulative, and it hurt me in ways I couldn't fully articulate. Amy had paid for Susan's flights, her hotel stay, her meals, and even compensated her for her time, using our emergency fund to do so. The same emergency fund that I had refused to touch because it was meant for real emergencies, not for testing my loyalty. I felt betrayed. The woman I loved, the woman I had married just 3 months ago, didn't trust me enough to believe that I would stay faithful to her. She needed proof, and she went to extreme lengths to get it. I asked her why she didn't trust me, and she insisted that she did, that this was just a way to ease her mind. But I couldn't accept that. If she truly trusted me, she wouldn't have needed to test me in the first place. The argument that followed was explosive. I yelled, something I had never done before, and Amy cried, pleading with me to understand that it wasn't her fault, that Jessica had planted the seeds of doubt in her mind. But I couldn't hear her excuses. All I could think about was the betrayal, the lies, and the money she had wasted on this ridiculous scheme. I stormed out of our apartment, slamming the door behind me. That night, I stayed at my friend Jacob's place. Jacob and I had known each other for years, and he listened patiently as I recounted the events of the past week. He was shocked, and as I spoke, I could see the sympathy in his eyes. But he didn't sugarcoat things. He told me, bluntly, that Amy's actions were a red flag, that trust, once broken, was incredibly difficult to rebuild. He suggested that I take some time away from her, to think about what I really wanted. And he wasn't the only one who had an opinion. His friends, who had gathered at his place for the night, all chimed in with their own thoughts and advice. They told me I had married too young, that I should have waited until we were both more mature, more financially stable. They questioned my decision to combine our bank accounts, to give Amy access to my credit card. In their eyes, I had made a series of mistakes, and now I was paying the price. It was a harsh reality to face, but there was truth in their words. I had been naive, believing that love was enough to sustain a marriage. I hadn't considered the importance of boundaries, of clear communication, of mutual respect and trust. The next morning, I woke up feeling numb. My phone had been blowing up all night with messages from Amy, from our parents, from friends who had heard about the fight. I ignored them all. I wasn't ready to talk to her yet. I needed time to process everything that had happened, to figure out what my next steps would be. Jacob offered to let me stay with him for a few more days, and I gratefully accepted. During those days, I thought long and hard about what I wanted, what I needed in a relationship. I realized that, despite everything, I still loved Amy. I wanted to make things work, but I knew that things couldn't go back to the way they were. There had to be changes, and there had to be boundaries. I couldn't continue to be the sole provider while Amy wasted our savings on irrational tests. I couldn't allow her to undermine the trust that was supposed to be the foundation of our marriage. So I made a list. A list of boundaries, of non-negotiables, that I would present to Amy. First, she would have to repay the money she had spent on Susan's trip before she could return to school. Second, we would create separate bank accounts, our finances would no longer be combined. Third, she would be responsible for her own student loans. I would no longer be paying them off for her. Fourth, I had already removed her as an authorized user on my credit card. And I would be getting a new card with a different number. And finally, I told her that she would have to cut ties with Jessica and Susan. I couldn't trust her to make the right decisions if they were still in her life. It was a harsh list, but it was necessary. I knew that if Amy truly loved me, if she truly wanted to make our marriage work, she would understand and agree to these terms. I texted her, telling her that I would be coming over the next day to talk, and that I needed space until then. She agreed, and for the first time in days, my phone was silent. The next morning, I went back to our apartment. Amy was waiting for me, her eyes puffy from crying. She looked at me with a mixture of hope and fear, and I could see how much she regretted what she had done. We sat down, and I laid out my terms. She listened, her face growing pale as I spoke, but she didn't argue. She agreed to everything, her voice barely above a whisper as she promised to do whatever it took to fix what she had broken. It wasn't an easy conversation. There were tears, apologies, and moments of silence that felt heavy with all the unspoken words between us. But by the end of it, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe we could make this work. Maybe, with time and effort, we could rebuild what had been broken. The weeks that followed were challenging. Amy kept her promises, she paid back the money she had spent. She cut ties with Jessica and Susan, and she respected the boundaries we had set. But trust isn't something that can be rebuilt overnight. There were moments when I doubted her, moments when the anger and hurt resurfaced, threatening to pull us apart again. But we kept trying. We went to couples therapy. We communicated openly and honestly. And slowly, we began to heal. One day, a few months later, Amy looked at me, her eyes filled with tears, and said, "I'm so sorry for what I did. I love you, and I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you." In that moment, I knew that she meant it. I could see the sincerity in her eyes, the regret, the love, and I realized that, despite everything, I still loved her too. Love is messy, it's complicated, and it's not always enough. It takes work, patience, and a willingness to forgive. Amy and I learned that the hard way. We learned that trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild, but it can be done. We learned the importance of setting boundaries, of communicating openly, of respecting each other's feelings and fears. Our marriage isn't perfect. We still have our moments of doubt, our arguments, our struggles, but we're stronger now, because we faced our biggest challenge and came out the other side together. And in the end, that's what matters. Trust is the foundation of any relationship. And once it's broken, it takes a tremendous amount of effort to rebuild. Amy's actions were a reflection of her insecurities. And while they were misguided and hurtful, they were also an opportunity for us to learn and grow as a couple. In the end, our love for each other was stronger than the mistakes we made. And we were willing to put in the work to heal and move forward. If you're in a relationship, remember that trust isn't something to be taken lightly. It's something that must be nurtured, respected, and protected. Testing your partner's loyalty in a manipulative way will only lead to pain and distrust. Instead, communicate your fears and insecurities openly and honestly. Build each other up, support each other, and work together to overcome challenges. And for anyone who finds themselves in a similar situation, know that it's okay to set boundaries. It's okay to demand respect and to expect your partner to value your trust. Love is about growing together, not tearing each other down. And sometimes, the greatest act of love is being willing to forgive and start anew.